Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard Podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing the announcement of the All-Star reserves, kind of who belongs, who doesn't, and then also discussing a few of the trades that were made here to kick off the trade deadline season. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. All right, so this week, the remaining All-Stars were announced for the All-Star reserves. Out east, we're going to have Jimmy Butler, Darius Garland, James Harden, Zach LaVine, Chris Middleton, Jason Tatum, and Fred VanVleet. Out west, it's going to be Devin Booker, Luka Doncic, Rudy Gobert, Draymond Green, Donovan Mitchell, Chris Paul, and Karl Anthony Towns. So were there any snubs here? I really think for the most part, under the current format, at least this is fairly accurate. Out west, I would have really liked to have seen a guy like DeJounte Murray get in, but in a guard slot, there's really not a guy I would have replaced him with as far as the Western Conference guards. You're not going to replace Devin Booker, Chris Paul, Luka Doncic, even Donovan Mitchell. You're not going to be replacing those guys to add DeJounte Murray, a guy who's, on the one of the worst teams in the West. They're competitive and they may get into a play-in, but I still think they're in the teens for wins. So it's hard to argue for putting a guy like that over somebody like Luka Doncic, we'll just say. And given the injuries, like specifically to Anthony Davis, some of the time missed, I think the Western front court is really accurate. Even Wiggins as a starter, my personal problems with that aside, it's more to do with the format. I think he should have been an all-star this year. But when you look at the front court guys, votes wise, it was going to be hard to replace him with any of the other front court guys. But as far as the Western front court goes, I feel like that they pretty much nailed that. Out east, I've seen a lot of complaints about Chris Middleton getting in, and I think that's fair. I think it's fair to complain about that. His numbers have been a bit down this year from last year, not too far down, but still down nonetheless, and down from what we've seen him do in the past. Format wise, I'm pretty sure he's considered a front court player. So we would presumably have to replace him with another front court player. So that rules out a guy like Drew Holiday, who I would have rather seen get in over Middleton. But given the limitations of the all-star format that we currently have, you can't do that. Front court guys out east, I would have rather seen. Jared Allen would be at the top of my list. The Cavs have been a great story this year, and he's been a monster on both sides of the ball, really efficient around the rim, as well as obviously the rim protection side. He's one of the best rim protectors we have in the league. Not quite to the degree of Rudy Gobert, but he's definitely in the top group of guys as far as rim protection goes. I've seen Siakam get thrown around by some Raptors fans, but they just haven't been good enough record-wise to warrant 2 all-star selections. And, if you want to replace VanVleet, again, he's a guard, and I wouldn't replace VanVleet with how good he's played as opposed to having Siakam in there. The Cavs and the Bucks, I think having 2 all-stars, particularly with the Bucks, since they actually have 2 in there, but I wouldn't have been upset to see Jared Allen get in over Middleton, and the Cavs have 2 all-star selections. Their record this season warrants them having 2 all-star selections, either of those teams. Also worth mentioning, Jimmy Butler. My personal bias aside for the Heat, if I put that on the shelf here for a bit, I think he might be a little bit undeserving as an all-star this year, just because of the games that he's missed. He's missed quite a few games this year, but it's hard to imagine with the Heat, as good as their record has been this year, not getting a single guy in. And based on the current format, he's the obvious choice for the representative from the Heat. Bam Adebayo's missed even more games than Jimmy, and Tyler Hero is a guard. Therefore, we can't throw him into a front court slot under the current format. Guard-wise, it's really tough to argue with what we've got out east. I would have liked to seen LaMelo, and I mentioned Hero. I would have really liked to see him in the All-Star game. I think he's been really deserving of it this year. Both of those guys have. But if you look among the guards here out east, there's really nobody here to replace. Maybe James Harden, but that's more my own personal bias against him than really a knock on anything he's done this year. It's been worse than what we've seen in years past from Harden, but he's still playing at an all-star type level. And the Nets, while they've sputtered lately without Durant, they're still going to be a contender there at the end of the year. I've never really been one to get upset over the all-star selections. Some years I don't even watch the game. I've been watching it lately with the new format with the draft. It seems like the games are a lot more competitive and guys at least try down the stretch. In years past, that wasn't the case. I'm talking like 10 years ago or more. Um, but I am going to get upset about all NBA selections when that time comes. That's a totally different thing for me. With respect to the All-Star game, though, I'm going to continue and I'm going to die on this hill that we need to be going positionless with the voting here. There's no reason to have positions. It doesn't make any sense. And they're arbitrarily, it seems like, choosing what guy belongs in what position. DeMar DeRozan has played large stretches of this season at power forward and at three if you really want to be generous, but it's been mostly power forward for him this year. Yet he was considered a guard. And maybe you want to make the argument, well, by skill set, he is a guard. Well, then what about LeBron? He was considered a front court player. Jimmy Butler, when Kyle Lowry's been out, he's been taking on the bulk of the playmaking. So why was he not considered a guard? So I have no idea how they're choosing what position belongs to who outside of the obvious things like Nikola Jokic or Chris Paul, like obviously being front court for Jokic and, guard for Paul. Outside of those, I don't know how they're choosing who belongs to what position. It seems like there's no consistency in how they're doing it. So let's just make it really easy and just get rid of the positions entirely. Let the fans and the coaches and the players decide who belongs regardless of position, and let's just have a lot of fun. It doesn't need to be this complicated. All of the mess and all of the debate that we've seen for who belongs and who doesn't, who got snubbed, it's mainly to do with the format that we have. If we didn't have the format, we would get the right guys in. And come Hall of Fame time, all-star selections do matter a little bit, but for the All-NBA, it really matters. And so they need to really make sure we're understanding who's in what position and making a good case for a player belonging to a certain position, or get rid of it entirely is kind of my vote. All right, next up, trade deadline stuff. We finally got some deals done. It's been kind of a quiet year so far. I guess we had the Bol trade, but this really marks the first, the Clippers and Trailblazers deal really marks the first deadline deal of any significance. So the Clippers are sending Eric Bledsoe, Keon Johnson, Justice Winslow, and a future second-round pick. They're getting back Norman Powell and Robert Covington. Wow, what a deal for the Clippers here. I know Covington at times has looked like he's cooked as far as his on-ball defense. It's just not been great. It never was really that good. I think he's been kind of overrated on that end, but at least with respect to the on-ball defense. But and as he's gotten older, it's only gotten worse. But he can still hit threes, and he plays great team defense, great positional defense in the team concept. So this is going to give the Clippers at full strength the most depth at wing in the league. And he's also an expiring contract, so if you don't like it, you can always let him go. With respect to Covington, Norman Powell, he's a really effective scorer, and he can guard up in position. He's only 6'3", 6'4", somewhere in there, but he's got a nearly 7-foot wingspan, so he can guard bigger guys because of that. He's a 19-a-game scorer, 45% field goal, 40% on threes. And considering they gave up very little, and I say very little, I want to say nothing, but I guess very little if we're being generous to make this happen. What a great deal. Even if they don't get Kawhi, Paul George back this season, Powell is a guy who's under contract, and he's a guy who's going to really help them moving forward. He's somebody who can play crunch time for them and help them out on both ends of the ball. So I was really positive, for the Clippers side of this. I'm fairly negative on the Blazers side. I really just don't understand what they're doing here. It looks like they're obviously moving into more of a rebuilding phase, and I'm not sure that this was the deal to really get it done. Norman Powell was a real asset, and they really didn't get a lot back for him. And especially when you look back now, because Gary Trent was turned into Norman Powell. So Gary Trent currently is a 23-year-old, 18-a-game scorer who's shown that he is capable of playing really good defense in the playoffs. We saw it firsthand when the Blazers were in the bubble. He was guarding LeBron for large stretches of that Lakers series and was holding up okay considering the size difference. I have to imagine with a more manageable matchup, at least size-wise, he could be really effective in a playoff series on defense. And he's just been torching the Heat. He's been absolutely torturing us. And he had like a 6-game stretch where he was averaging 33 points a game this season. So he's really turned it up. So the Blazers turned that into Norman Powell, who they've now turned into Eric Bledsoe. I can't imagine any Portland fans are really thrilled with that. It's just really shocking. And it's not a surprise. They're kind of a rudderless ship right now with only an interim GM. And he's showing that he's really only an interim GM because it's just been a disaster so far. I just can't really imagine this was the best case or the best deal for Norman Powell out there. An efficient 19 a game scorer guard with a nearly 7-foot wingspan. That's something tons of teams need. Teams also always need wing depth. So Robert Covington is still something there. All they really got back here is a washed up Eric Bledsoe, who this summer a team traded down for in the draft just to get rid of him. Justice Winslow, who I don't know, maybe he could do something, but he's rarely healthy enough to do anything. Keon Johnson was a late first-round pick, so maybe he turns into something over time, but that's definitely a risky proposition at best. And then a second-round pick in the future, a guy who may never even suit up for the Blazers. They gave away real assets to do that. And Bledsoe's contract is like pseudo expiring. I think they still owe him $3.5 million next year. I think that's all he's guaranteed. So the buyout situation with him is manageable if you don't want to keep him on for $17 million. And I can't imagine the case for that, or $18 million, whatever he's at next year. So this ownership is, I mean, this move is saving ownership some money, but that's really all it's doing. Justice Winslow is not really a real piece at this stage in his career. He's not shown really much promise since early on in Miami or when they had him running the point. Maybe Portland sees him as the evolution of Evan Turner in that role player piece, but I still can't imagine the case for giving up Norman Powell and Robert Covington to do that. The cap room situation here, moving Norman Powell doesn't get you any closer to getting a star around Damian Lillard. So they really should have just gotten back some real assets, like a protected first-round pick at the very least. And that would be something that they could package together with something else and maybe turn that into another star or an upgrade on the roster. As it stands now, they didn't really get anything to show for this. So there's not anything that they can shuffle down the line here to retool around Dame. So let's try to find some silver lining here. This has got to be the start of the rebuild here. I have to imagine Nurkic is next up on the block, and he should be next up just because his deal is expiring. He needs to take priority, and getting a deal done for him needs to take priority. Then after that, CJ. They need to focus on bottoming out this year so that they can get a high draft selection, at least in this year's draft. Then you can decide whether or not you want to trade that high draft pick. Hopefully the ping pong balls fall your way if you're the Blazers. Then you can decide whether or not you want to package that together, try to bring a star in with Dame in the offseason, or you could just do a complete teardown and move on from Dame. So I have to imagine that's what they're doing. I'm leaning towards complete teardown at this stage, just based on what they got for this package. I'm not real optimistic that they're going to get a lot for CJ and Nurkic moving forward. And if Dame's health continues to be an issue, it might be time to just kind of move on and start over here. They really didn't get anything back, as I mentioned, in this Powell deal that they're going to be able to swing for future assets or anything that they're going to be able to retool around Dame with. So I have to imagine the complete teardown is coming. It's really hard to feel good about this as a Blazers fan. So I think they should just buckle in here for the complete teardown and just kind of hope the ping pong balls are going to fall their way here the next couple of years. And, you know, maybe after 5 years down the road, once they get some young guys in here and completely start over, maybe they can learn from the mistakes that they've made in the past with Damian Lillard and really get that going. So right before I sat down to record, literally right before I sat down, I saw this deal come through. Karis LeVert heading to Cleveland. Cleveland will be getting back from Indiana Karis LeVert and a 2022 second. Indiana gets Ricky Rubio's expiring, a lottery-protected 2022 pick. Worth mentioning, the Cavs are not finishing anywhere near the lottery this year, so it's just going to be a first-round pick this year, late first-round pick. 2022 draft and second-round pick from Houston, and a 2027 second-round pick from Utah. I'll start with the Indiana piece because it's the most boring. I mentioned that pick that they got is going to be a late first. The Rubio expiring contract is great, so they save money on Karis LeVert. He was only under contract for 2 more years, but they get out of that a year early, so they're saving money there. And hopefully with that pick, they're able to at least get a role player or some guy who could be like an eighth man in a rotation. I wouldn't have expected much more from a Karis LeVert haul. So a decent job by them to get that. I feel like Norman Powell and him are very similar. So to see the package that Indiana was able to get back from Cleveland versus what the Blazers got back, and not to mention the Blazers through Robert Covington in that deal, a kind of night and day difference. For the Cavs, this is exactly what the doctor ordered. They were a team that was desperate for someone who could create their own shot, help them down in crunch time. When I've watched the Cavs this year, it could sometimes be a real struggle for them to get baskets in the half court, especially down the stretch of games. So LeVert is a guy who can create his own offense to some degree of success, and that's a guy that they really needed. Does this make them a title contender this year? Probably not, but it's getting them a lot closer. Garland and Mobley just aren't quite there yet. Also, Jarrett Allen, not quite there yet. In a few years, they absolutely could be a title contender. And LeVert is still young enough that if the Cavs extend him past next season, he could still be a piece for them in that finals run.